So we have a couple of really wonderful sessions this morning, and it's my great pleasure to introduce this wonderful lady in front of you, who I should stress is just 22 years old. So I'm sort of in awe. So I'm going to say a little bit about Alicia. She's actually going to talk about the 6th Armored Division, which is a kick-ass armored division in World War II. Went from D-Day all the way through France, several campaigns, and ended up being one of the elements, the American elements that liberated Buchenwald concentration camp. That's the first concentration camp that the Americans came across in Nazi Germany. And you are going to focus, I've seen the presentation, and you're going to focus not just on the armored division, but actually highlight several individuals so that we can get to know some of these remarkable characters better. Alicia is a history scholar, and 2023, so you're a recent graduate, just graduated from Washington State University, recipient of WSU's Academic Achievement Scholarship and a member of the Delta Gamma sorority. What's a sorority? I mean, joke.
I swear they're accolades.
I have seen Animal House. I know what a sorority is. The Honors College recently selected her thesis about the U.S. Army's heroic 6th Armored Division service as WSU's sole nomination for the National Collegiate Honors Council. So the teachers in this room will know what a big deal that is. And you, this fall or autumn, as we say, you're going to continue your academic career at Central Washington University, working toward a master's degree in war and military history. Can I just say, as a professional, semi-professional World War II hack, I'm so happy that you're going to do that. That's fantastic.
Thank you.
Thank you. So without any further ado, please welcome Alicia and her presentation.
Okay, hi everyone. My name is Alicia Callahan, and it is truly the honor of a lifetime to be here talking to y'all about the 6th Armored Division. Since we have a little fan club going, I also want to say hi to my amazing friends and family, and my BDF family, of course, and Professor Raymond's son, who I wouldn't have been able to do this research without. So with that being said, the 6th Armored Division is an American tank division that fought in the European theater of the Second World War. They landed on the beaches of Normandy 42 days post D-Day, fought through 10 months of continuous frontline combat through the Battle of the Bulge, mind you, which ultimately led them to liberate Buchenwald concentration camp on April 11th, 1945. So I know you're thinking, how did I, of all people, become obsessed with tank divisions? This all truly came about because someone very important to me, his name is Thomas Hackler, was a soldier of the 6th Armored Division. My great uncle, Harold, was telling me that his father served in the 6th Armored Division and no one really talked about it. And thank goodness, Thomas Hackler wrote a very extensive memoir accounting his experience with the 6th Armored Division to be able to get assistance from the VA due to his injuries, mental and physical, that he sustained while overseas. After reading his incredible and harrowing memoir, I realized that oftentimes military history conglomerates divisions or units into one, instead of recognizing that each and every soldier is the one that accomplished what was done, not the entire division. They may have worked under the name, but it was each man's sacrifice, strength, and confidence that was able to carry this through. So through my presentation, I touch on multiple soldiers of the 6th Armored Division, and I really, really want to honor the children and grandchildren of the soldiers who helped me do my research. I reached out to them and they answered with open arms, sharing memories and memorabilia only previously seen inside their own families up until this point. So it's been so incredible, and I just thank each and every one of them for allowing me the honor to share their family history so we may never forget these soldier sacrifices. Okay, ooh, it buzzes. Okay, so just a little background, tank divisions. In the 6th Armored Division, and pretty much every tank division of World War II, there were two things that were used to get around. On the left, we have a half track, and a half track is just like a truck in the front, but it has the wheels of a tank in the back, like a track. And that's what mortar squads of 8 men would use to travel from one site to another with relative ease and safety. And on our right, we have the M4 Sherman tank, which was the most common tank used during the Second World War. This tank may not have been as sophisticated as the German defenses, but we are soon going to find out that the American soldiers knew how to use them to the best of their ability. So just going straight into the childhoods of these soldiers, because I think it's very important to touch on how prepared they were for war without even realizing it. They all had incredibly difficult childhoods. Here's a picture of soldier William Lumen in 1922 shooting a .22 shotgun. And this is how their lives looked. They all grew up during the Great Depression, so obviously there was endless struggle. And for just about every man in the 6th Armored Division, they came from the country, which means they truly learned how to survive on what they were given in the country. This was actually no coincidence. The United States Army did, in fact, seek out farm boys for their armored divisions. This is because they had the assumption that these men would be very familiar with operating heavy machinery, namely the double clutch, which was necessary for operating the tanks during the Second World War. Through this, something that I found out through talking to all the descendants, and even Thomas Hackler writes this in his personal memoir, that during basic training, it was like the shooting and the survival aspects of training were second nature to them. It just felt like they were home. It was incredibly easy. A lot of these men were 16 years old, didn't finish high school, had no extensive education. So they actually learned the most during training in their math and English classes, which I thought was very interesting because it's completely opposite as to what it was today. So because of that, they were incredibly prepared for war. Also, as a girl from the farm myself, I am a huge proponent that there's no one more resourceful than those who grew up in the country. You really learn how to survive on your own. You live off the land, and that's exactly what these men did. And you're going to see as I go through my presentation, the ability of these men to not only survive, but be able to think quickly on their feet without taking a second beat is one of the reasons our American soldiers are the greatest generation. Okay, so first thing we're going to talk about is training in California. So training in California began in 1942, but I'm actually going to talk about training in Camp Cook that began in March of 1943, and because this is where the soldiers spent 10 months of their training time. It was quite interesting, like the desert training, because although they were working incredibly hard, and we're going to read Thomas Hackler's personal remembrance of just how horrible this training was, they also had an abundant amount of time to figure out how to entertain themselves. And although the United States Army didn't realize what they were doing, they gave the men incredible time to build those incredible friendships and camaraderie that is so essential for surviving in war. So here's William Lumen on the left, boxing a fellow soldier. That's something they did quite a bit. They made jokes, they had fun, they did just about everything. But also, while being in Camp Cook, the soldiers had time to think about what they were getting ready to fight. And I'm not one for reading notes during a presentation, but I think this next passage is so powerful. I just want to read it straight from the words of William Lumen. Here is his actual writing from 1943. His son, Bill, graciously sent me hundreds of his father's letters that I've had the absolute privilege to read. So William Lumen wrote this to his wife, Viola, on March 18th, 1943. It's a bit of a long one, but I think this perfectly encapsulates the American spirit of World War II. And quote, "I've only been away from home for a little over 3 months, and yet it seems like years. It's funny, the things you miss the most. Of course, darling, you come first. Then there are lots of other little things, like sitting around the dinner table with your family, or listening to the radio, walking around your own yard, or tinkering with your car, or chatting with friends. Remember the way I used to keep looking through the real estate section of the Sunday papers, hon? And the way we used to dream and plan about that little home of ours? Gosh, it all seems so far away from me now, and so futile at times, especially when a couple of men trying to gain fame and fortune by the blood and sweat of other men can disrupt our plans so quickly. But sweetheart, it's those little plans of ours and millions of other young couples like us that are going to win this war. We really have something to fight for, sweetheart, and we just won't be beaten. As I've often told you before, those plans of ours will all be carried out if it's the last thing I do. But first, we have to show those madmen and their followers that our way of life and our beliefs may not fit in with their plan of a new order, but it's what we want, and we will fight for it. If we can't persuade them with discussions or speeches, then we will pound it into them in such a way that the last war will seem like a tea party with what they will get this time." And then he goes on to say, he went into this war believing he wouldn't want to hurt anyone, but he finishes it with, Most of us are just about ready to sail over now. Just remember, darling, that I love you and only you, and that something I have to fight for is you and everything you stand for. So I just felt like that was an incredibly important thing to know of during this time. These men really had a moment to think about their wives and their children and their families they left back home, and they were ready to get over there to defeat these men so they could return to their life plans that they had created long before this war. So here's Thomas Hackler, the man that inspired all of the research. This is about one of two pictures that even exist of him. So it may not be the best quality, but it just fills my heart with so much joy to be able to look at it. So Thomas Hackler, he remembers Camp Cook, much like I'm sure many of the soldiers did. And he talks about the desert. Most of these boys came from the Missouri hills, like over on that side of the country. So they were quite shocked when all they saw was miles of desert. William Lumen wrote in one of his letters to Viola, "Darling, you should have seen it. These men had never seen the ocean. They were like little kids running on that beach." They just absolutely loved it. And Thomas Hackler just says, it is something that he will never forget. He said bugs and snakes became their bedfellows, and the mosquitoes were happy they had the soldiers to feast on. He said his mouth was always so full of sand and his eyes burned like hell. But this is where the issue comes in, of the United States Army always making sure the soldiers had enough beer in order to alleviate as much of that pain as possible without offering them anything else. And this, unfortunately, is where Thomas Hackler, as for many soldiers, began their journey of referring to alcohol in order to aid in the comfort that was required. Let me see what time we're at. Okay, and then here we have Steve Neofatistos. His daughter Sheila is incredible. She has the thickest Boston accent. I love it so much. But Sheila, when she was growing up, she could never quite understand why her father Steve was so terrified of snakes. This man had grown up on the farm. He owned a farm when he returned from the war, but he could not handle snakes whatsoever. If you've ever been on a farm, you know that they are your constant companion. She later found out, years and years after he returned from the war, that in order to keep one another alert during training at Camp Cook, they would throw snakes into each other's foxholes in order to keep them alert. And that is something that affected Steve for the rest of his life. He genuinely could never be near a snake because of how traumatized he was just from Camp Cook and the snakes being constantly thrown in his foxholes. And that's another example of just the camaraderie and friendship they had. They were comfortable messing with each other. They were just brothers. And Steve, when he returned from the war, he went on to become a very successful farmer. And his daughter Sheila said that her and her entire family were so proud to have him as a father. He worked until he passed away in 1970, unfortunately. But here is a lovely picture of Steve while he was in service and while he was on his farm. Okay, and then finally, in February of 1944, the soldiers of the 6th Armored Division leave Camp Cook and get ready to go overseas. While they were on their way overseas, Thomas Hackler remembers thanking God he was not in the Navy because he had his head over the rails, throwing up the entire time. Seasickness runs in the family. So they finally go overseas, and at this point, the men are really starting to feel connected with one another. And this continues to grow as they wait for the D-Day invasions in Great Britain. Here we have the soldiers of the 6th Armored Division at a tea party in Great Britain. And once again, I cannot emphasize enough how country these boys were through and through. I'm just picturing my own family at a tea party and it makes me laugh. This was completely outside of their comfort zone. And not only were they adapting to getting ready to go to war, they were adapting to completely new cultures and foods and experiences. All of them in their letters, or their children would tell me that they would just ask for meals or treats to get sent over there because they were not a fan of the food that was there. And considering I was in Normandy with veterans, they're still not a fan of the food overseas, but they try their best. And then, but while they are overseas waiting to begin their Brittany campaign, which is their first campaign, they once again had a lot of time to wait. And they knew that they were waiting for an upcoming invasion, but like most, they had no idea when that was coming. A letter that William Lumen wrote to Viola on April 9th, 1944 says, Nothing of importance has happened around here lately. Of course, all the talk is centered around the coming invasion, which, by the way, can't come too soon to suit me. The sooner it starts, the sooner I get home, which is all that interests me. I'm at that stage now where I've been away from home long enough to get homesick. And this is where I just really want to touch on that camaraderie and that brotherhood growing again. Overseas, I feel you really get the effects of homesickness. So they had to lean on each other to get through this new world, like by themselves without their families. Okay, finally, on July 18th, 42 days post D-Day, the soldiers of the 6th Armored Division began one of 5 campaigns. This is the Brittany campaign. They landed on Utah Beach and they began their drive up the coast to try to capture the Brittany Peninsula. This peninsula was incredibly important because they needed it to create ports for the United States Army to bring in supplies. So the Brittany campaign was, these men had never served before. They were just new soldiers. They didn't truly know what conflict was. So this definitely was their go time. Here, I had the absolute honor when I went to the beaches of Normandy just last month with the Best Defense Foundation. I had the honor of standing on Utah Beach with Andy Negra of the 6th Armored Division. And it was the most emotional thing I've ever done. And he got to tell me about his own memories of landing on Utah Beach in 1944. Andy told me he was just like all the other soldiers. He said all of them had never left their small towns. They were just so shocked and they couldn't stop looking at the architecture. Although they were on the hunt for Nazis as well, he said he just felt like he was on a new, exciting journey and he just couldn't quit. He couldn't stop looking around and admiring all the beauty that was around, even though it was obviously a horrible circumstance. But Andy said he quickly learned to respect the Germans, but when they first began their Brittany campaign, they were just so in awe of being there. Oops, I meant to go back a little bit. And then also, once again, I couldn't include another picture of Thomas Hackler because there's only 2, but I want to touch on Thomas Hackler really finding his why of fighting. He, like all these men, didn't especially want to go over there to start killing the Nazis. But Thomas Hackler said that one day he will never forget. I'm sorry if I mess up the pronunciation to all my French watchers. They went through the town of Plouvian and took it, but the Germans retook it. When the Germans retook this town, Hackler says that they killed the dogs, the donkeys, the pigs, every animal for absolutely no reason. And then Thomas said, as a farm boy from the Depression, I fit right in with the farmers there. Them dumb animals never hurt anybody. From that day on, I really hated the Nazis. And he really didn't have an extreme passion for fighting quite up until this point, because once again, they're the Depression kids. He had to hunt for his food in the Missouri hills. If they didn't get anything, he had nothing. But the Nazis slaughtering these animals was the thing that really turned him on his head and made him fight with anger and with passion, because he just felt so disrespected by it. It's important to note that during the Brittany campaign, moving on, since this was their first campaign, the 6th Armored Division really focused on bypassing German strongholds. So they really didn't come into much contact with the Germans at this time. Doing a little page flip. They really didn't come into much contact at this time. They did have one bridge buildup. They had a bottleneck, and it was the worst in the division's history. But it never happened to that extent for the remainder of the war. And that just shows how quickly these men had to figure out their learning curve. And I feel like we can all confidently say just about every division of World War II did that. But they very quickly picked up what needed to be done. At this time, the soldiers also learned how to have extreme respect for the Luftwaffe, the German Air Force. And this is what's really important about the Second World War, and something that once we get into the Battle of the Bulge and how it affected the men then, it's important to note that studies done by the National Medicine says that soldier performance is exhibited in a bell curve, because after just the first night of combat that goes through the night, soldiers' sleep patterns, confidence, everything is negatively affected. It disrupts their sleep patterns. It just disrupts absolutely everything. And the Second World War was one of the first world wars where new technology allowed this fighting to happen all through the night. So these men never got a break. They were sleeping in foxholes. They were burying as deep into the ground as they could in order to avoid getting shot or strafed during even nighttime, which is a very different thing. Okay, here we have Master Sergeant Milton J. Murray. Once again, as I was saying, these soldiers had a lot to learn, and his story is so hilarious to me. I just felt like it needed to be touched on to show just how much they needed to learn. So Master Sergeant Milton J. Murray, he was in charge of supply trains in Europe. And one day he was on a supply train that was full of supplies, very few American soldiers, right? He pulls up to a French village, which he thought was the right one he was supposed to be going to, because if you don't speak French, speaking from experience, they all sound very similar. So he accidentally went to the wrong French village, which was completely occupied by German Nazis. However, these Nazis saw the giant train that was coming into the town, and thank goodness they just assumed it was full of American soldiers and it was an offensive attack. So in return, the German soldiers left this town, and that is how Milton J. Murray accidentally liberated a French village. He didn't even know it. He stayed and was enjoying beer with the French people that he liberated until he finally figured out that he was accidentally in the wrong place. So it's just stories like that. A lot of them were just left to kind of figure it out themselves. They didn't have phones, technology. There's just a whole lot of maps. So Milton's daughter, Dorothy, was absolutely incredible. And she was telling me that Milton J. Murray was put into an orphanage when his mother gave him up when he was incredibly young. He's one of those soldiers that lied about his age and went into war at 16 years old. He obviously did not finish high school because of this. And despite that, he went on to create a very incredible life. He wanted to be buried next to soldiers when he passed. He didn't care if he knew them or not. And when he died, he got the 21 gun salute and is buried at an American cemetery, military cemetery. So just absolutely incredible. And then once again, we're moving on further into the Brittany campaign. The United States government remembers the Brittany campaign by saying, personal experience in patrolling, handling booby traps, and forward observation, veterans were born overnight. They had to learn fast. They were facing an experienced foe who knew all the tricks. And that could not be more accurate. Here we have Lieutenant Rush Wallace, who I absolutely love this man. He has the best stories in the world. And there's just a couple I want to talk to you about. The first one being Lieutenant Rush Wallace. He was once again one of those resourceful farm boys. His grandson, Sean, calls him the original flipper. He knew how to fix anything, and he was an intelligent one. So Rush, even though nothing had happened and no one had told him to do this, he would go to the cooks of the camp and ask for the use salt and sugar bags. With those bags, he would fill them with sand and line the bottom of his Jeep just for protection. One day, a captain told Rush that he needed his Jeep, and the captain said it, so obviously he let it happen. And so the captain left with Rush's driver, Clarence Kelly, and at that point, while they were on their drive, they hit a landmine. However, and this is a picture of the Jeep after it hit that landmine. However, because of Rush Wallace's ingenuity and his ability to really take initiative, both men survived. The captain lost an eye, and Clarence Kelly had some injuries, but was able to fight. And because of Rush Wallace, Clarence Kelly is alive today at 103, which I just think is absolutely amazing. So Rush and Clarence constantly got into some trouble. They pretty much every story Sean told me about started off with, they were lost. And that's how all of Rush's stories started off. We were lost. If you know about the World War II, they had horrible maps. They really depended on the Michelin maps to try to figure out where to go. So one day, Rush was out on patrol with Clarence Kelly, and he was lost. So he got out of the Jeep and went to the back of it and opened up a map while smoking a cigarette, trying to figure out where they were trying to go. Rush was telling his grandson that he was facing away. Someone came out of the bushes behind him and said, "Do not turn around. I am with the French resistance. This is a Nazi-occupied village. You need to drive away." And Rush did what he was told. He did not turn around. He just got in and drove away. And then while they were driving away, they ran into a patrol car, and he told them the story. And the patrol car said, "No, we liberated that a few days ago. This town is okay." And Rush was like, "Okay, just warning you." That patrol car went in and was hit by a German bazooka as soon as they entered. So I just feel like it's really important to touch on the importance of the French resistance fighters during the Second World War, because I wish I knew just how many American lives they saved by sacrificing their safety in order to help So Rush Wallace came home and continued flipping houses. And I'm going to talk on him a little bit more in the Battle of the Bulge, but he was just absolutely amazing. Okay, and then the Brittany campaign ended on September 17th, 1944, and the 6th Armored Division, you will soon find out, just about never had a break. So they began the Salle River campaign on September 18th of 1944. The Brittany campaign was absolutely incredible, and the men at this point in the game were starting to feel a little bit more confident, a little bit more ready to fight. They knew what they were doing. And actually, the Salle River campaign was incredibly fascinating because this is when the men actually started seeing combat, in close combat, if that. They figured out an incredible system of trying to shoot the Nazis out from the buildings to send them into basements. And then their artillerymen and infantrymen would go and throw explosives into these basements. So they're really figuring out strategy, and their confidence is growing exponentially. So the Saar River campaign began on November 8th, and this one lasted until December 24th, 1944. And I'm not sure if anyone can take a guess on why this one ended sooner than the rest. But while they were on the Saar River campaign, these men were really starting to get pushed a little bit further beyond their limits. They really had to concentrate a little bit more on being able to crack the stubborn enemy defenses. And that is when however, the United States Army acknowledged the abilities and quick learning of the 6th Armored Division when it wrote, "The Super Six was never stronger than when it launched the Saar River campaign. It had lost valuable men in hard fighting, but experience had created battle-wise veterans. These time-tested troops still relied on the skill and cunning they had absorbed to crack the stubborn German defenses," end quote. So, but there was a problem with the Saar River campaign. It was intended to be quick and seamless, much like the Brittany campaign. However, the German defensive were just too strong, and it was very difficult to be a rapid and overwhelming takeover, much like it was the Brittany campaign. And the weather certainly was not helping. It was getting increasingly colder at night, and all the men remember just how freezing they were. And as we get into fighting at the Battle of the Bulge, that obviously exceeds tenfold. So the Saar River campaign was, I would argue, one of the hardest campaigns for Hackler. This is because this is where mental health really comes into discussion about what may have happened. At this point, during the Saar campaign, Hackler had made his best friends. He was very comfortable with them. He felt safe. However, there was a new man brought into the 128th Field Artillery Battalion, which is what Thomas Hackler served in. This soldier had come from Italy, where, according to Hackler, he had apparently had a bit of a mental break. But this just shows how badly the United States Army needed soldiers and how little there was a focus on mental health while on the front lines. There was no post-traumatic stress disorder. It was battle fatigue. And the United States Army just needed soldiers so badly, they choose to ignore that aspect. So this man who kind of lost his mind, in the words of Hackler, over in Italy, was sent to the 6th Armored Division. However, with that being said, one day something set off this soldier, and he killed multiple of his fellow American soldiers, one of whom being Thomas Hackler's best friend. He said he just remembered walking out and couldn't breathe, and that was his first breakdown he had of the war. At this point, obviously, they were used to fighting and they were used to death, but they had never seen one of their own soldiers kill their comrades. And I think that just perfectly demonstrates how quickly mental strength was completely collapsing at this point in the war. And it wasn't the soldiers, it was just the circumstances. No amount of strength or confidence could offset the effects of that long extended period of frontline combat. Doing a little time check. Also during the Saar campaign, we hear of some incredible stories of survival as well. Here we have Private First Class Wallace Wilmer Hughes. And once again, I want to read a story that was written by Wallace's wife following the war about what his experience was on the Saar campaign. She wrote, "On the morning of November 12th, 1944, as part of the 6th Armored Division, 21-year-old Private First Class Bill Hughes was a part of a crew of young men manning a Sherman tank east of the Nied River near Ramilly in northeastern France. It turned out to be the wrong side of the river. The morning was damp and foggy, much the same as we've been experiencing this past week in the Willamette Valley. He has said that it felt pretty lonely on that side of the river, as they were the lone tank that had crossed a pontoon bridge before it was blown up. He was sitting inside the tank at his post as a loader, looking through a periscope. As they swung around, he saw through the periscope a German soldier with the German version of a bazooka on his shoulder. He was standing and aiming at their Sherman tank. Bill was hollering at the gunner to go get that son of a bee, but with the tank turning, the gunner could not find his aim. As the bazooka was fired, Bill could actually see through the periscope the shell coming at them. It hit the tank, piercing its exterior and shooting hot shrapnel throughout the interior. At the same time, the tank hit a landmine and came to a screeching halt. He was conscious throughout, but not able to get himself out of the tank. Another crew member pulled him out of the hatch as he tumbled down into the hole excavated by the landmine. He remembered looking at his right leg, which was turned in a totally unnatural position, thinking to himself, that doesn't look good at all. It was the beginning of the rest of his life. His road to recovery was long, with many months of hospitalizations and many surgeries. On May 7th, 1946, he was honorably discharged from the Army at O'Reilly General Hospital in Springfield, Missouri. What lay ahead of him was a lifetime of learning, adapting, and perseverance. He was never bitter, never complained that his life didn't turn out the way he had envisioned. As a young man, he just adapted and did it very well. He was a veteran, a hard worker, a good father, and a wonderful husband. So Wallace Wilmer Hughes, here's another picture of him returning from war in his wheelchair. His mother actually got a letter that it looked like he wasn't going to survive. And he had a complete out-of-body experience while he was in surgery. He was standing over his body, and he remembers this so vividly. But that didn't stop him. He went on to live his life, and he just called himself the busted up old vet. Her name is Kay. His daughter remembers that even throughout her entire life, for the rest of his life, he would just be in a casual conversation, pull out a knife and dig some shrapnel out of his leg that still came to the surface, which is the most World War II vet thing you could ever imagine. But that didn't stop them. They just kept going. That brings me on to the Ardennes campaign, which was pretty much the Battle of the Bulge. Did I pull something out? Okay, we're good. Which was the Battle of the Bulge. They had to shoot over to fight at this battle, as it was their job to protect the southern flank of the American defense. At this point, the 6th Armored Division, the area they were protecting, they were outgunned and outmanned by 6 German divisions. It was the 6th Armored Division compared to 6 German divisions. And at this point, the men really, really began fearing for their lives. Here we have a letter Lieutenant Rush Wallace wrote to his wife, Margaret. And it says, "Margaret, dear, you have been a wonderful wife. I guess it is just that you are a wonderful person. I think Rush, Edis, and Patty Lynn Wallace are very lucky people. I hope that is the will of God that we spend our 12th anniversary together. If it should be otherwise, please believe me when I say I love you dearly." And a lot of these men had very similar experiences. They were really pretty much saying their goodbyes to their loved ones. And I think that perfectly sums up the effects of the bulge. At this point, you're going to see all of these men had reached the top of the bell curve of their battle performance. They had been pushed far too hard. They had been at nonstop frontline combat, constantly fearing their lives, running on little to no sleep. And as I go through these stories, I really want to preface once again, it was no fault of the soldiers themselves. They really had no control over the damaging effects war has to a young boy's mind. So here we have some pictures at the Battle of the Bulge. I just want to give everyone an idea of how brutal it was. And there's another one, just icy, cold, fighting through everything. So here we have Sergeant Andy Giambroni. Sergeant Andy Giambroni wrote in his book, Odor of War, that the war could not have been won without the American soldiers' ability to compromise. It truly was the best thing they had for themselves. Andy wrote, "These were brilliant young men who never went to school or may have never had the opportunity, especially during the Depression years of the 30s. It was hard to believe there were so many soldiers without formal education. This was in the 1940s, and many could not read or write. The guys were masters of improvisation. And that is so true. William Lumen is one of many who used his own urine to unlock his frozen machine guns and bolts, and they used blow torches and grenades to thaw everything. These men, once again, were using whatever they could. They just instinctively knew how to survive. They would cuddle together at night to try to stay warm. They just did whatever they could. One of my favorite things, one of my favorite Andy Giambroni stories was that he got a package of socks delivered, and he only had a few pairs, so he kept one for himself, and he gave some guys a pair, but some guys could only get one sock. And Andy said, well, it's better than a kick in the ass. And that's pretty much, he even wrote that comedy was one of the things that they really would lose it in those harrowing times. But if someone was actually able to make a joke, it could just make the entire situation better for all. So Andy went on to fight through the war, and only 17 days after returning home, he went to vet school. So he followed his dream. And the reason he went to vet school is because his older brother was a vet. And this is where this ingenuity and ability to improvise came. While they were in France, they came across a woman that was about to give birth. And he had never birthed a baby before, but he had birthed a calf. And so he used what he learned working on the farm to help this woman deliver her baby, who had been in labor for many days at that point, and he was able to help her deliver her child, which I just thought was incredible. And then we have Sergeant Joseph Howard Hoot Marriott, Hoot was his nickname, who was in the 231st Armored Field Artillery Battalion. And once again, like pretty much a majority of the Super Sixers, he had a very strenuous childhood. However, during the Ardennes campaign, the most difficult moment of his life really would come. He fought incredibly hard. He was in tanks just about the entire time. And he said that his most exciting day in combat was when one of his tanks were shot out from under him and he crawled right into the next one. In total, he had 2 of his tanks that he was shot out of, but he carried on into the 3rd. However, his daughter was telling me that although she was born after the war, her name is Hope, that her cousin was telling her, who was born before the war, that she had no idea who her father was before he left. He was a completely different man. And this was something Hope really had to learn to adjust to throughout her life. She told me the story that one night her cousin was on a date and brought home her boyfriend onto the front porch, and who had heard them outside, and his PTSD, which followed him for the rest of his life. Something set him off hearing a man's voice on his porch, and he came out with a shotgun ready to defend his home because they were constantly on edge. They were constantly ready to go. However, despite all the PTSD that followed Hoot for the rest of his life, before he passed away of pancreatic cancer in 1985, he was a wonderful, loving husband and spent his free time hunting and fishing in the vast countryside of Missouri. So Staff Sergeant William Lumen had been sent into the field hospital in November of 1944 before the Battle of the Bulge began, as he was just needed a little bit of treatment. His mind it was a very difficult time, as we know. So unfortunately, he was needed on the front lines. So he was sent back to the 6th Armored Division on January 4th, 1945, which unfortunately was the hardest day of the 6th Armored Division had against the enemy in the division's entire history. They experienced so much fighting and so much relentless artillery from the Germans. And so many men were lost that day. And unfortunately for William Lumen, that was the day he returned. William Lumen was found hiding in a church in Luxembourg, suffering from, at that point, what they would call battle fatigue. This battle fatigue carried him the rest of his life. He really struggled. He moved his family from the big city into a small little town where son Bill told me they had absolutely no neighbors because he couldn't handle even the sound of a car backfiring. It was incredibly difficult for him. Despite all of that, he worked incredibly hard to create a life for his family. His son, Bill, is a huge World War II lover, and especially in trying to understand his father just a little bit more. He wrote in his own diary and his own research, Bill wrote this, and I have his permission to share it. Quote, "So did I discover what type of terrible event or events sent my father, the tough guy, over the edge? I think so. It wasn't just events. It was a combination of inhumane living conditions that would wear anyone down and being subjected to a horrendous artillery barrage from naval-sized guns that killed his best friends. His best friend is this one right here. His name is Smitty, and he was killed in battle. And this was William's absolute best friend. And his son went on to write, and yes, maybe piling up German bodies like cordwood in French barns created the first chink in his armor. And I just think that is so beautifully written and perfectly explains just how difficult the Battle of the Bulge was. It wasn't just the killing. It wasn't just the enemy fire. It was losing best friends. It was freezing temperatures, the coldest winter in decades at that point. But these men fought through it. Major Dr. Robert Loeffler was a surgeon for the 6th Armored Division, and that day he earned a Bronze Star as he crawled straight into enemy fire to take over for another American doctor who was suffering from battle fatigue at that time, and he crawled straight into fire to take over for him. Loeffler was an incredible soldier, and he was incredibly humble, as all of these men were, which is why it's so important to me to share their story. Because they did not want to share it themselves. He even pulled 26 men out of a burning tank at one point, and his family did not know about this until they found a newspaper clipping after he passed entitled "Chicagoan Saves 26." And that just shows how quietly humble and amazing these men were. And then we go on to the Dasburg Prum campaign, where the 6th Armored Division is credited with being some of the first American soldiers to fire into Germany during the Second World War. Here we have the sign that said, "You are now entering Germany through the courtesy of the United States Armored Division." They were actually able to cross through the Siegfried Line, and they put on one heck of a fight. And then we have the Germany campaign, and this is where things are going to get incredibly difficult for the men. I really want to note that at the start of the Germany campaign, these soldiers, although they were on a very strict time crunch, they were able to see the Saale River from their second campaign while they were up on the hills of France before going back into Germany. These men, although they had not stopped up until this point, they took a break and held a memorial service for the soldiers of the 6th Armored Division they had lost thus far. And I think that perfectly shows the brotherhood. They never talked about what they had done. They never talked about how incredible they performed at the Battle of the Bulge. All they could focus on was the soldiers they had lost and the job they have to finish. And during this time also, there were some comical events. Thomas Hackler was actually there. I don't know if any of y'all are familiar with this story. This is the beloved General Patton urinating off the Rhine River. Thomas Hackler was actually able to be there for that event, and he recalls, and in Patton's own words, Patton said, "I urinated in the Rhine River and I took dirt from the other side in emulation of William the Conqueror." And Hackler recalls that being one of his most fond memories of the war, that despite all that they had seen, they were still able to joke and they were ready to fire into Germany. Unfortunately, what they weren't ready for when they were in Germany was what they would experience on April 11th, 1945. As the division entered Weimar, Germany, the first thing they were met with was a horrible and unbelievable smell. And they followed that smell and they were able to discover Buchenwald concentration camp. Here's a picture that has never before been seen that was taken by Rush Wallace the day that the camp was liberated. This has never been shared outside of the Wallace's family. And these men were so used to seeing death and destruction, but they had never seen it against anyone that wasn't an American or German or French citizen that was a cost of war. But here they were seeing thousands of Americans that were either dead or on the brink of dying. On that day, they liberated 21,000 starving men, women, and children. And they said all of those that were alive looked like the living dead or the walking dead. They used all of those different things to talk about it. Thomas Hackler recalls that in one cage, a group of ladies that looked like skeletons, just skin over bones, were huddled together. They were people. Wrong one, sorry. They were trying to cover their naked bodies. They were trying to protect themselves, but they had nothing for cover. By now, I was really sick. And I don't want to go too far into the brutality of what they saw, but I just want to talk about the effect it had on these young men who had already experienced at this point 10 months of continuous frontline combat. But for every child of the soldiers I talked to, they said it was by far the absolute worst experience of their life, and undeniably so. Here we have a picture. This one is from Life magazine. And I just really want you to picture being a young man walking into this. These soldiers really had nothing to do, and that nothing had prepared them for this moment. I truly cannot emphasize that enough. And this is the night that would affect them for the rest of their lives. And then here's another picture that was taken by Rush Wallace of one of the prisoners of the camp standing in front of the ovens, where Thomas Hackler remembers opening the oven and still seeing parts of the bodies that were in there. And he lived with that for the rest of his life. Thomas Hackler wrote on this experience, "I still have dreams every night about Buchenwald and the people that I met there." No, I was so confused why everyone was laughing. I haven't actually read the hat. So he wrote, "I still have dreams every night about Buchenwald and the people that I met there 56 years ago. After we got the prisoners cared for at Buchenwald, the 6th Armored Division moved out in a field to rest at Buchenwald, to rest for a few days. My unit, the 128th Artillery Battalion, stayed there until the end of the war. I don't remember just how we moved around after that because I was so traumatized by the events at Buchenwald." Hackler goes on to say that because of this event, he had to go to the VA many times for his problem with alcohol, but they only would try to help him get away from the alcohol. They never really tried to figure out why he was so addicted to it and why he couldn't stop. He lived in physical and mental pain for the rest of his life. He had anxiety attacks every night, never slept. And he said he could only sleep about 3 hours a night. He said that he was a perfectly healthy young man until he came back from the war, and he had health problems for the rest of his life. And this is where the importance is. The children and grandchildren of the soldiers of the 6th Armored Division are the reasons that their fathers' stories are alive today. Their fathers didn't talk about the incredible things that they accomplished or the horrors that they were forced to endure from 16 to 25 years old. For many of them, their prefrontal cortex was not even fully developed before they went to take arms in Europe. But I truly believe, as our teachers, and I know I'm the younger one telling this to y'all, but I thank you so much for ensuring that their story lives on. Like, it is a very common saying, someone dies twice, once when it actually happens, and the second time when their name is said for the last time. And I'm really grateful, I'm really grateful to the families of these soldiers who are allowing me to make sure that I can at least play my part in making sure that their fathers and grandfathers' stories live on for the rest of their lives. They came home from war and began their longest campaign yet, which was creating lives and legacies their families could be proud to share. Thank you all. Thanks, guys. Does anyone have any questions? Go easy on me. What was that? Oh, what do I have?
Kershaw.
Okay.
So, maybe it is, yeah. Let's put you in Korean.
Ooh. Sorry.
Can you see the question? So the question is, have any of them met a Jewish person before?
What was that?
Ooh.
And then how do they treat them after?
I enjoy that question. Okay, so here we are talking, I'm gonna flip just back there. I want to make sure that I say this right. So Rush Wallace, as I mentioned, he was a house flipper before we went to the war, and he came back to continue that. And his grandson was telling me that he truly never had a single racist bone in his body. And as we learned from yesterday's presentations, this was an incredible thing. When he came back from the war, his grandson thinks in part it was due to how quickly he saw what a divide or like a racial discrimination like could quickly turn to something horrible. He made a point to try to offer African Americans jobs, and he would try to employ them to ensure that he was doing his part to end the divide in our country after seeing what it did overseas. Any other questions? Yeah.
Other than the 6th armored, were there other armored divisions that liberated Buchenwald?
I focused greatly on the 6th Armored Division. I think they were the only division that was fully intact. It was really difficult because they would kind of get sent out or separated here and there. So like, for example, the 6th Armored Division landed on Normandy 42 days post D-Day, but Thomas Hackler writes in his memoir about landing on D-Day. And I didn't include in the presentation because I haven't been able to find primary like scholarly work to back that up, but he speaks with such confidence and he is able to talk about things that aren't discussed in common culture. I really do believe it. I'm just looking for that little piece of backup. But 6th Armored Division is widely credited to be the liberators of Buchenwald concentration camp, and they're honored as such by the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum.
Yes. Talk about your trip to Normandy,
Mm-hmm.
what you did or what you found out when you were there.
Mm-hmm. So I had the absolute honor of going with the Best Defense Foundation. That's a huge majority of my fan club. Once again, hi y'all, love you, miss you. And we got to bring 43 World War II veterans back to the beaches of Normandy for the 79th anniversary of D-Day. And once again, anyone on this chat will tell you, I don't cry in my normal day-to-day life. I bawled like a baby every 5 minutes talking to these men. Even though they had gone through so much and they had fought their entire lives to build this country even to what it is, they were constantly checking on us, the younger one, like the younger generations. They would constantly make sure I was okay or everyone else was. George Saros was always worried about my blood sugar, who is a World War II vet. He would sneak me a Snickers multiple times a day. It was lovely. But we got to bring them back to the battlefield. We got to bring them to Carentan, Pointe du Hoc. That we were able to stand on Omaha Beach on the anniversary of D-Day, where we got to watch Andre run on the beach, which was the most powerful moment I'd ever seen. And go Best Defense Foundation. I'm truly so grateful for the opportunity to have been able to do that. Do I have any other questions? Okay, thank you all so much for listening.
I don't want to cut into these ladies' time, so I have not too long an introduction, but I'm speeding through it quite quickly. So thank you both for being with us. It's a great honor for you to present with us today. So the presentation following is about a World War II officer, a guy called Tony Acevedo, sorry, who was a medic in the Battle of Bulge. I'll point out that that's the deadly battle for Americans in the European theater in World War II, 18,000 killed, over 30,000 wounded. He was also a prisoner of war in Berger Elston. So you guys have used his personal diary, and we're going to explain why that diary is an important historical source, it's a primary source of course, and you're going to talk about his experiences and do so mostly using his own words. Thank you for that. So I'm going to say a little bit about Miriam, US Marine Corps veteran. You serve right now as Director of Operations for Maintenance and Facility Services with Dallas Independent School District. For that, you taught English literature and reading for middle and high school students. You're a graduate of the University of North Texas, and you have a master's degree from the University of North Texas, Dallas. And then Kathleen, thank you for being with us. You taught at Thomas Jefferson High School in Dallas since 1997. Thank you.
Forever.
Wow, that's quite a long time. You graduated from the University of North Texas, University of Texas at Dallas with a BS in History, and a master's in history. So without any further ado, over to you guys. Thank you for being with us.
Why, thank you. Thank you for having us. We're so grateful to be here in Washington, D.C. Hi to everybody online. We have lots of resources to share with you from the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum prior to our visit today. One of which that we will highlight is Anthony Acevedo's story. One of the reasons that we wanted to do that is to highlight an individual story, which is one of the things that we have seen so much during this conference so far this week. So I am a museum teacher fellow for the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum. Jerry Lynn is also a museum teacher fellow. Do we have any other fellows here? Fabulous. So we'll tell you all about that project. Just stop by and see either one of us and we'll share that project with you. Okay, so this is our agenda. We're going to share with you some foundational resources before we get to Anthony Acevedo's story. We're going to look at some classroom resources so that, you know, I was going to say Monday. I hope nobody's going back to work on Monday. No, it's terrible. Or, you know, in a month or two when you go back to school. Sorry, Monday. I also am going back August the 1st. You will have some resources that you can use immediately when you go back to class. So the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum has created teaching guidelines. They're pretty much universal guidelines for when you're teaching any subject, but there are 10 guidelines. We're going to focus on 3, although there are 10. So firstly, defining the term or defining your terms. So when you're teaching about the Holocaust, if you are in the state of Israel, there is a definition. If you're in the city of Dallas and you're using the Dallas Holocaust and Human Rights Museum, they have a definition. If you live in the United Kingdom, the Imperial War Museum has a definition. It's a great activity to look at commonalities and differences in those definitions. So starting with that foundation of a common vocabulary. And we can pop right out to the definition, right? I'm going to not spend a lot of time on that guideline because we're going to go and visit the museum later today, and you'll have a great opportunity to see that later on. But there are 2 other guidelines that I want us to pay attention to. And the first one is avoiding simple answers to complex questions. I don't know about y'all, but my students always, I think they're looking at a visible watch and waiting for 2 seconds before the bell rings. And then they ask us the big question, right? Why didn't the Jews fight back? Why didn't they just leave? Bell rings. Oh no. Do I answer that question right now? Do I say, let's be thoughtful about it and let's revisit this question tomorrow? It's very challenging when you're talking about a big topic like World War II, like the Holocaust, not to think, oh, well, let me just give them a little something to satisfy them for now. And then you are answering those complex questions with a simple answer, right? So those are things to avoid. And we're going to look at some lessons to help you do that. And then the last one, as I said earlier, is something that we've been doing all along with this conference, and that is translating statistics into people. We look at some big numbers. How many soldiers were involved? How many millions of people were murdered during this conflict? Our students are overwhelmed by those numbers. And how do we help them to connect with this history? They hear the stories that we've been listening to all week, right? So let's look at some ways to do that. When you are in the museum this afternoon, one of the ways that you will be able to connect with people is right before you get onto the elevator, you'll be given an identification card. How many of you have been to the museum before? Fantastic. And so you know about that identification card as you get onto the elevator. And as you tour through the museum, you have the opportunity to see that history through the viewpoint of an individual, right? You wanted to talk about your experience?
Well, yes. So I was very blessed also to teach ROTC in the middle school, which led me to this conference and Holly back in 2017. So another really cool thing that I got to do as a teacher is come here and attend this conference. We were here, got to see a lot of amazing places, but because of a very good friend of mine, I knew I had to stay an extra day to go visit the Holocaust Museum. And I can tell you halfway through, I was completely physically, emotionally overwhelmed as I should be. And however, the museum does a really great job guiding you through that so that I was able to get through it and come out of it changed.
Mhm. So one of the things that you can use is the Holocaust Encyclopedia when you find, oh, you know what? I have this question. I really wanted to learn more about camps. I really wanted to learn more about rescue or resistance. Or when you are back in your classroom and you want your students to do research, there's a lot on that Google's. Yeah. And when we send our students off to it, we sometimes peek over their shoulder and find, they are not using a historically vetted site. They could even find themselves on denier sites. When we have our students doing research, we can send them confidently to the Holocaust Encyclopedia, knowing that it's historically vetted, that they're getting good information, and it's all there, right? There are also critical thinking questions. It shows them how to cite that information. So it's a great place for them to go. Next, I have buttons for this. I'm not used to having buttons for this. Okay, so in looking at activities for using this in your classroom, some of us have a lot of time. Some of us teach AP US history. Some of us teach world history. There's a lot of different ways that we are encouraged by our state to teach about the Holocaust, to teach about World War II. And we have varying amounts of time. This activity that we're going to share with you and ask you to kind of participate in is the timeline activity. It encourages our students to think critically, but it's also incredibly flexible. So we're going to show you some of it, but first.
Yes, before we get into that, let's go ahead and see if we can all order our own activity cards and see if we can have those delivered either to your own doorstep or to your campus in about 4 to 5 weeks in the summer.
Yeah, so I'm going to flip us back to the beginning. If you want to use this QR code, I have all of the links that we're going to share with you. You can use that to get to all of the links from today. You're also going to get, Holly's going to share with you the presentation. I'm used to using QR codes with our students. If you're not a fan of QR codes, you can just Google USHMM timeline activity. And then I'll show you exactly where to go to order your timeline cards. We'll leave this link up for another moment. Okay, so if you're struggling, you can always just Google USHMM timeline activity. And it's going to look like this page once you get there. So on this page, it's going to give you some more information about the activity itself. It's adaptable for grades 7 through 12. I've seen people use it as early as 6th grade. It's multidisciplinary. It's usable in English courses, history courses, art teachers. I've seen use it. I actually did a collaboration with our band teacher. They were playing music from Terezin. So we did a collaboration with band several years ago. The cards are available in Spanish. So if you have a collaboration with a language teacher, or you have second language learners like I do, you can either put them both up, put one up. It's up to you. So before I tell you more about the cards, we're going to go ahead and order them. So about halfway down the page, it says printed copies. You're going to click on the link that says request a printed version. Everybody sees where I am? Okay, so they're going to ask you for some demographic information. And you can pick the address where you want it sent to, your school or your house. And then at the bottom, it's going to ask you, select the time card packs that you want. Do you want them in English or Spanish or both? Do you want the extension packs if you're teaching Anna Frank, if you're teaching night, and racial science and law in Nazi Germany. We'll give you a minute to fill that out so everybody can have their own set, and then we'll show those cards to you. And if anybody's stuck, just put your hand up and we'll be happy to help.
The last time I went to the Holocaust Museum, I had some word class that
Mhm.
there's identification cards and they gave them to.
The ones that you receive at the door are different than the ones that we're talking about, but you can sometimes request those if the
They're feeling generous.
well, and the line's not too busy right there. Sometimes if there's a ton of school groups, they don't have them right there. But yeah, you can.
Yeah, I have a class that I give them out to the kids and
Mhm.
if they really like to talk about what happened to their person.
Absolutely. Those are based on the same profile cards that y'all are going to read in just a minute. So let's take another minute to finish that up so we can move on, please. Okay, so while you're finishing that up, we want to show you what you're going to receive in your time card packs. So they are going to send you little cards that look like these from 1933 to 1945. So you get, and they're all shrink wrapped, and I open these up and somebody can take these home. We'll have a drawing or something. Thanks for the idea. I don't have any little tickets, but we'll come up with something. 1939 is a different color, so it highlights the year the war began. Does anybody teach about the wars beginning in 1939? Why would I ask that question that way? As U.S. history teachers, when do we teach the war beginning? Pearl Harbor, right? Lots of U.S. history teachers don't teach about it as beginning in 1939. They talk about it as 1941. So you can draw, underline it, circle it. In my classroom, which has shifted a number of times over the past 3 years, I was in a portable classroom. I just want to share with you how you can actually implement this in your classroom a couple of different ways. I put magnets on the back. I had a metal classroom. So I put these on the outside and the kids kind of toured and manipulated the timeline on the outside of the classroom. Some people have lots of wall space like we have in this room. And so you can tape them up on the wall. Some people don't have that option and they would have to put up a piece of butcher paper that they could take down. So some people, I had a colleague that used string and they were able to hang it from the ceiling. So it's a really flexible activity that you can use in a bunch of different ways. Miriam is holding the historical events cards. They're a different color. So your students who are more visual in that way will see the years in white, and then they'll see the historical events. I kind of pulled aside the ones that are more closely related to the war. So you can have events that are more focused on the Holocaust, Kristallnacht, the Nazis' rise to power. And then you can pull aside your ones that are more closely related to the war, if that's helpful to you. There are also 3 other packs, the laws and decrees. What I think is so interesting about this one, as a teacher who is teaching US history in a couple of different levels, is it also includes all the way up into civil rights history. So that I think is helpful. And then there are 2 other extension packs. One is about Night. This is a book that I teach about in my classroom, and one is Anna Frank. These are packs that you might share with an English teacher if you're a history teacher. Another way that you can extend this activity is to do one that's local. I met a woman from New Mexico, Arizona. This was last week. She's from New Mexico, Arizona.
Yeah, Andy's card is not.
Okay. And so they did local history,
Mhm.
and she was from the Navajo Nation. And so she did it specifically on what was going on in their community. Super cool way to connect with your students in your own community, what was going on. You could do one that's very specific to your community and World War II veterans, people when they left, what was going on in that community. So I think there are different ways to use it. So now we're going to actually use this activity. So these are the profile cards. We just printed them on bigger paper so everybody can have their own. So we're going to hand them out to you. You're going to get to read about an individual. Everybody's going to get one, and then we're going to ask you to share them with another person. Sounds good? All right, let's do a thing. Take that out. Okay, that's fine. Okay. You're welcome. You're welcome. I have another. Oh, there's 3 there. Need to put some lotion on.
Yeah.
Oops, one more.
We're gonna make Holly. We're gonna make her.
Y'all want to read one? Do you still have cloth linger in your hand, or did you hand them out? Okay.
Oh. Yeah, it's
Okay, and when you are finished reading your profile card, I will ask that you stand up and find somebody across the aisle or in a different row. And in your own words, share that person's story. What did you learn about them without reading the card like our students would do? Just tell them about that person. Stand up, stretch your legs, and you have 2 minutes to do so.
Thank you so much.
I know it fosters a lot of discussion, but let's move back to our seats, please. Thank you, everybody. Thank you, friends. Let's move back to our seats, please.
What is it they say about
Hi.
teachers?
I can't do it.
What they say about
One
teachers?
clap,
Say
two
that
claps,
I
all the
get
things.
that.
I can't do
Ding,
it.
ding, ding. No, no.
If I was in a high school classroom, I'd say something about children and all the things, but okay. Okay, so there's a lot of them and we could go around the room and have everybody share something. That's what I would do with my high school students. We'd then post them. We'd post the laws, then we'd have the students interact with those cards and see how did the laws impact the people. It's a really interesting lesson. Again, you can do it in 60 minutes. It's possible. I teach AP in a dual enrollment class. You can also save it for after that all-important state test and spend a little bit more time with it. I leave it up all semester. If you teach about World War II in a US history class and you don't start teaching about the Holocaust until 1939 or 1941, you miss that context of what happened 1933 on. If you're an English teacher and you are teaching nights, that book essentially starts in 1944 with the murder of the Hungarian Jews. It's a little bit, a year or so before. If you're not teaching, if you start with the beginning of that book, you're missing a lot of context. And if you don't have a lot of time to prepare your students with that context, this activity will help you do it, right? It's an activity that I try to leave up all semester, space provided, and it really helps my students to put the history of the war, put the history of the Holocaust into context. The murders don't start until later. When they ask those big questions, Why didn't the Americans do something? Pearl Harbor happens when? Right? Most of the people who are murdered during the Holocaust are murdered in 1942. The Americans don't get there. It's virtually impossible, right? We're going to learn a lot of that history this afternoon. So keep those cards. We'll share the set that we brought with us later on today, and then you'll get another set. You can share one with your colleagues. Let's move on to another individual story. This is a resource called Behind Every Name, animated short stories, video stories created by the USHMM. And Miriam's going to tell us a little bit about Anthony Acevedo before we get started.
So we are so happy to present on Tony, aka Tony Acevedo. He was born in San Bernardino, California in 1924. As a Mexican American, he faced prejudice and grew up in a segregated nation. And at 13, his life came to quite a big surprise hit him and his family as the United States enacted the Mexican
Repatriation.
She has to help me with that one. Repatriation Act. And so as a result of that, which was when the United States deported over 1 million of its own citizens. And as a result of that, Anthony's stepmother and father were deported to Durango, Mexico. And he and his siblings followed suit. He went to school in Mexico and then returned to the United States as he was a U.S. citizen to attend college in hopes of becoming a doctor. Pearl Harbor is attacked. Anthony joins the U.S. Army and serves as a medic. Fights in the Battle of the Bulge, as you will see more details in a little, and really faces some incredible, harsh, and cruelty in his life at that time.
So let's see Behind Every Name.
In the fall of 1944, U.S. Army medic Anthony Tony Acevedo was sent to fight in Europe during World War II. He served in the 275th Infantry Regiment, 70th Infantry Division, known as the Trailblazers. In freezing temperatures and heavy snow, along with 600,000 fellow Americans, he faced a ferocious German offensive in the Battle of the Bulge. During the brutal 6-week battle between December 1944 and January 1945, tens of thousands were killed or wounded. It was Tony's first combat experience, and he bravely tended to the wounded under machine gun fire.
We went to battle, and on my assignment, I headed with Company B, and I just followed. I carried my duffel bag and all my equipment with me, and everybody used to laugh at me and yell at me and say, "Anthony, drop all that stuff. They're gonna kill you. You're a sore thumb, you." I said, "No, that's gonna save my life." We were marching towards a ridge, and I heard an echo, "Medic, medic," because there were machine guns going on back and forth, and I was carrying my stuff with me, so finally I picked up the sound and I started to head downhill. Then I saw up ahead a cave with Germans. Well, there were about 6 Germans in there with machine guns. I mean, you thought there were thousands of them. And at that time, when they start shooting at me, my stuff went up in the air, my duffel bag and everything. I fell on the ground and crawled to my helmet. And before I knew it, I was with the fellas that were wounded. I had my prayer book with me, and I would use some phrases that wouldn't be too long, but enough for that person, that soldier, to motivate him, make him feel motivated and feel free of fear. That's what he was. He was afraid. The Germans were getting closer and closer. We ran out of ammunition until finally we were caught when the Germans came up the hill, and we had to surrender. When the Germans took us, They forced us to get our boots off and walk down the slope barefooted in the snow. It was up to our waists and marched for about almost a mile to the trucks.
They were sent to Stalag 9B, a camp for prisoners of war near Bad Orb, Germany. Tony became prisoner number 27016. Conditions in the crowded camp were terrible. Tony used the limited medical supplies that he had managed to save in order to treat the sick and wounded. In January 1945, German officers began identifying and separating Jewish POWs and those whom they believed to be Jews from the rest of the American soldiers. Tony was also separated, perhaps because he was Mexican-American. The newly separated group, including Tony, were then transported to Berge an der Elster, a forced labor camp in Germany. Much like the conditions in the prisoner of war camp, food was scarce and prisoners were given little sustenance for the hard days of forced labor.
The bread was a mix of barley with sawdust, ground glass, and ground sand. It would make you sick to the stomach.
Disease and malnutrition would soon plague the American prisoners.
On one occasion, we received a package, a Red Cross package, and that's how I got my diary.
Throughout his time in the camp, Tony kept a secret diary of his experiences. He wrote in it nearly every day. In it, he recorded how his group were forced to clear tunnels to make way for an underground factory that Nazi officials hoped would be out of sight of Allied bombers.
March 21st, 1945. More planes came over today. Their bombs were dropped not very far from here. Another one of our boys is pretty low today. He's not expected to live till night. April 3rd, 1945. Excellent news today. Americans are only 100 kilometers from here. Rumors are that we are to be moved away.
When the Nazi guards realized that the American troops were closing in, they evacuated the POWs from Berge on a forced march.
April 9th, 1945. We marched 10 kilometers today. We started out with 304 men. Now we have 287. April 20th to 22nd, 1945. Day and night it rained. Every man was wet from top to bottom. Every 25 yards there lay 3 or 4 men. Men that couldn't make the march had to drop out. They were shot. April 23rd, 1945. We were liberated today.
Of the 350 American POWs at Berge an der Elster, approximately 70 died. Most of them died or were executed during the forced evacuation of the camp. Tony's fountain pen miraculously endured his imprisonment. It allowed him to secretly document his first-hand account of life as an American prisoner of war in Germany, and would bear witness to the dates and causes of his fellow soldiers' deaths. This was, he explained, his moral obligation.
God gave me that ink to last.
So let's talk about a couple of things after watching that video. Why is it important to highlight individual experiences during World War II and the Holocaust? Makes them human. Thank you for sharing that. Anyone else has a response?
Because there were so many varied experiences that no two experiences are exactly the same. And it might relate to something your own students are going to. So it makes it relevant and ties them to the events, which is what we do.
I would say, how many of you have ever, I know I experienced that as a teacher. I taught mostly, we taught mostly, and she still does, mostly Hispanic population. And they would ask me, where were we? And in the beginning, I didn't understand what that meant. They asked that so much that they want to see where they were. Whereas in like culture, where were we? Where were Mexican Americans? Where were the Puerto Ricans? And people want to identify the kids. They do. Our students do. And we need to be that force that does that for them, right? Because they ask you a question, you've done a wonderful thing. You've sparked something. But then we got to follow through. And I had to learn how to do that as well.
Yeah, they want to see themselves in the history, right?
Mhm.
And
As
we
a
saw
Mexican
that from
American, I had to
Alex
do
the other
that.
day with all those different individuals, right?
Mhm.
How can we incorporate that into our classroom when our students want to see themselves in history? Anybody else has a response about individual stories? Is it difficult to do you think, to include all those individual stories? What are some ways we can do that? Or what are some ways that you do that?
The stories are in that.
There are 5. I'll show you all of them in just a moment. Yeah.
It would be cool to either like have the kids pick, and you can do it to where they sign up, so you know every name is covered, whether it's not students, however you want to do it. But have them watch that video, either if you have time or I don't, so over. But then when they come in to do kind of a think their share jigsaw situation with the other stories.
I was talking with Joe yesterday during Tyler's presentation. There's so many different individuals that we can look at. How do we incorporate them into our classroom, right? And the story of Christine Jorgensen, where do you find time for this person and that person? And I think it's so interesting. That's something we could put on the timeline. I was just thinking, wouldn't that be just an individual person and our students as they're doing their gallery tour or whatever it might be, they have another individual to add to their toolkit that broadens their understanding of this complex history that we're looking at. And it gives them a little more insight into America, right? When we keep saying this big place is all about all of these stories in one and one and one and one, right? It's not just their neighborhood, right? It's a big place. So what about artifacts? How can artifacts help us to understand an individual's experience?
Might highlight his level of perseverance. He found a way to hide a pen, to have a journal that helped him survive and therefore help others overcome their challenges. And years later, that can be an inspiration to someone for a variety of reasons. Maybe somebody who's challenged in right and saying, well, here's somebody who figured out how to do that under the most trying circumstances.
Sure. You wanted to say? Thank you.
Say that pen gave him a purpose and a reason to survive. So like what, in your kids' future or present, do they have it on to help them survive whatever they're.
And it also documents not just him, but he's able to document the other people. Sure. And it tells us a lot about the other people in his place where he was.
I think, just really quickly, I think
Please.
so, gives the students a connection, especially if you have the artifacts in person. And obviously, this is at USH, and you're not gonna have this,
Sure.
right? In the classroom. But if you can have any kind of artifact from somebody in your community or whatever, it helps sort of connect. So it's not just a face on a screen.
Right.
Right? Like, okay, this belongs to this person. It's just fun touching.
They really do.
Tangible effect.
Yeah.
It's a really good point. And to that point, we are going to actually look at this artifact. Now, your students will be able to look at it digitally. We are going to look at it on paper. So we're going to spend a little bit of time looking at some reflection questions because, we have to ask our students some questions, right? So I think what we'll do is we'll split up this first page. for this side of the room, and then we'll just kind of popcorn it out. And then we'll look at the document. Ooh, Mimi, I need one more for this row.
There you go. I'll get it.
It's printed for you. All right, teenager. I also printed it out. Thank you.
Yeah,
Thank you. And one for me. Thank you. Okay, so if we can have this half of the room look at questions 1 through 3, and this half of the room look at questions 4, 5, and 6. And then we're just going to popcorn them out in just a moment. And we're looking at this page of the paper first. And then we'll look at the document in just a moment. Okay.
Maybe else is that. Oh, we do one in letters.
Just in terms of reflection, what challenges did he face that we saw in that video? Yes, sir.
All right, so he's a medic, so his job is to help save those in those other soldiers. And one of the challenges he faces, in fact, is in these flats.
Yeah.
And
What else?
Because he's a medic, he has to go in front of the front line. to help.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Anybody else wants to share a challenge or how he overcame it?
Logical challenges, like, when they were on the hill, and not only did he have to overcome his own fear, but he took it a step further and supported the morale of his comrades too.
Thank you for sharing. And then I think for these last 3 questions, obviously you can change the questions to be whatever you want, but we can look at what did we learn about World War II from this story? What did we learn that we didn't know before? What's something that you didn't know before you watched that video?
The treatment of the American POWs.
The Geneva Convention, right? Aren't soldiers supposed to be treated in a certain way?
I think that one thing that would make an impact on students is that they force them to take their boots off.
Yeah.
And really walk their life.
At waist high snow, right?
Yeah.
Anything else that you learned that you didn't know before?
One thing else that would surprise our students would be that they separated Mexican Americans into Jews and Americans versus Jews.
Right. Interesting. Sir.
Did you ever explain why they took their boots? Was it to wear them themselves or?
Yeah, it's like psychological torture.
Okay.
Yeah, and to have them for themselves, but yeah.
Okay, and less chance to escape.
Okay, so I do want us to actually look at the artifact. Online, you can see more than just this page. And thank you for pointing that out. I absolutely can't read cursive because I'm a teenager. We don't learn cursive. So yes, I did translate that into the printed word, and I would do that for my students, but you can have them access this digitally and really like zoom in. Do we have a brave soul who will read this document for us? Thank you.
March 1st, 1945, more planes came over today. Their bombs were dropped not very far. Another one of our boys is pretty low. He is not expected to live tonight. On this day, we are expected to be moved to a better condition barracks that seems to me will be too rough on our hospital patients. U.S. medics went down to the SS kitchen for our food. On our way back, we were surprised to meet a British Red Cross trucks with Red Cross packages for our hand. This was a very, very busy day.
Okay, thank you. So, of course, I would want to go through each of these. I would have them reflect on each of these questions, but for time's sake, let's go to question number 3. What did you learn about Anthony from this diary excerpt? What can we take and pull from that excerpt?
He's a true medic and concerned with the wounded soldiers and
He was a true medic even when he was really a POW, right? He stayed in that medic, with that medic hat on. Mhm.
The Red Cross was bringing packages to the med.
And that's also, so he's got eyes out. He's watching, he's seeing what's happening, putting it on paper. So we can see it as well from his eyes.
Space is so magical, like a rational thought and reasoning. And that's an asset to keep the rest of them alive.
Right. I think someone else mentioned that before. It's been mentioned a couple of times that pen might have saved his life and others as well.
One of the things that I find so interesting is that he's paying attention to the war. He says the bombs are dropped not far from here. So he's, like, to your point about rational thought, he's paying attention to a lot of things at once. He's still got hope, right? Anybody else pick something else up from this reading? Yes, ma'am.
Speaking of the Red Cross packages, that's something new. I didn't know, and that they gave them stuff out of the packages instead of just keeping it.
So there was an agreement between the Germans and the International Red Cross that they could bring American POWs packages, but they had to be labeled to a certain Army soldier. They had to have their name on them. And so the International Red Cross or the American Red Cross got soldiers' names who were in the POW camps. And that's how they actually got to people, to those individual soldiers.
I think that I didn't know that POWs were sent to work camps. You know, or
So
that was new to me.
yeah, so at Berga under Elster, it was actually kind of two camps split by a river. And the British soldiers and the white American soldiers were on the other side of the river. And this is kind of a sub camp of Buchenwald. And so the American soldiers of color and Jewish Americans were sent to this other side where there were tunnels and they were digging a tunnel for armaments. So we do have just a little bit more information to share with you. I put a timer on there because I have students. Sorry. So after liberation.
Yeah, so we saw in the video, we saw that he was liberated in April of 1945, along with the remaining POWs. We also were given from him, we heard in his interviews, that he was at 19 and a half years old, and 4 months of being a prisoner of war, he weighed 87 pounds. And that's pretty close to what my own son weighed when he was the age of 10. Through looking at his words and his diary, we can definitely see several reasons why he survived. And your students would be able to pull that as well. His faith is throughout, his constant faith is throughout his diary. His hope, that he held strong to hope, his words of hope in his diary as well. His resolve to continue to wear that medic hat, even though he was facing his own personal struggles as a prisoner of war. And then absolutely his determination to tell the story, not his own story, but the story of those that were there with him through that diary. And so I definitely feel this is a great example of the power of the pen and how it was a reason Anthony Acevedo survived.
So a little bit more information after his military life. He was recognized, as you saw earlier, in 2009. There was a gag order placed on these soldiers who were POWs, and it wasn't until 2009 that the United States government recognized that POWs of Berga were also slave laborers. And it's at that time that the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum also recognized Anthony Acevedo and he donated his artifacts, his diary, his armband to the museum. And he registered with the Ben and Vladimir Registry of Holocaust Survivors. In fact, he's the only Mexican American to have done so. Right. So that's the question that we have as well. So we have that question into our resident historian, Dr. Becky Belding. So we're hoping to get that answer, because is that why the gag order was there? Was the gag order there because they were slave laborers? Was there a gag order on all Americans who were POWs that was then lifted? So we haven't gotten that answer yet, but when we do, we'll share it with y'all. Good question though. Thank you.
Anthony went on and had a long career, a successful career. He retired and continued to serve his fellow brothers and sisters as seems to be the veteran way, I would say, and all the veterans I've been blessed to know and meet. And so he volunteered at the VA, and on February 11th, 2018, he passed in that very same hospital. And I would definitely say that he keeps with our theme this week of destiny as character. And that's why we were so honored and humbled to present Anthony Tony Acevedo, who is, I would say, we would say the epitome of a lifetime of service.
So we have a couple of more resources to share with you. First, you asked earlier about the series Behind Every Name. There are 5 animated videos in the series. One of them deals with pen pals. For those of your students who don't know how to address an envelope, this would be a great one to share with them. Franz, a professor's plea, deals with a professor who looks at a phone book. Our students also don't know what that is. That's a good one. In terms of service, Eleanor and Gilbert, that is about a couple who realizes that they need to do something to help the Jews of Europe, and they literally go there to help people. And so anyway, it's a great series. The Olympics is the last one. And so your students could see a different story. Many of them are familiar with the fastest American of the time. So this would be an alternative story to share. All of them are accompanied by a lesson plan and an artifact. At the end of our presentation, we've shared with you 1 zillion links so that you can look at further resources from the USHMM. I'm just going to check and see, we have 2 minutes left. Perfect. So today, when you go to the museum, you're going to see 1 million artifacts. You're going to see 1 million resources, but there are 2 cards that have a little star on them. One of them is Gerda Weissman's, and one of them is Klaus Langer. Who has Klaus Langer's? Will you just tell us in your own words, tell us a little bit about Klaus Langer?
He was born in Germany, and he wanted to migrate to Palestine, and both kids went, and he went with them and his parents. His mom died of natural causes, and his dad was killed in one of the ghettos.
So Klaus Langer has an interesting and unique story in that we can learn a lot about immigration challenges. And one of the exhibits downstairs is called The Americans. It's a temporary exhibit. And his diary is featured in a lesson called The Challenges of Escape. And many of our students will ask, why didn't they just leave? Surely I would just get on a train, plane, bus, car, scooter, and off I would go, not recognizing the differences in historical context, time, and place. That lesson really helps them to understand what it took, the paperwork that it took for Jews to leave Europe, but also the challenges of the paperwork and other things to come into America at that time. So Klaus Langer is an interesting story. And then Gerda, will you tell us a little bit about Gerda?
She was 15. She's from Poland, and she was 15 when the Nazis invaded and captured her family. And she was sent to work in a factory. But in the factory, she got really sick, And so she's in the infirmary, and they heard that there was going to be an inspection though. And so it was actually a German woman who forced her and like literally dragged her back into the factory from the infirmary. And somehow she passed the inspection. And essentially that saved her life because they had killed a lot of the people in the infirmary. And after the war, she immigrated to the US.
So just a little bit more about Gerda. When she was liberated, she was in a space and this man opens the door for her and holds the door for her to come outside. And she says, a quote by Goethe, she says, "Noble be man, merciful and good." So after all that has happened to her, she still can quote Goethe. And that man was Kurt Klein, who she eventually marries, comes to the United States and marries. And he was an American soldier. And they tell their story. Hers is in a book called All But My Life. And she was a great friend to the Holocaust Museum. Both of them were before their passing. There is a one-day lesson. So if you're really pressed for time, there's a one-day lesson on the museum's website. That is all we have for you. Thank you so much. We appreciate your time. Please let us know if you have questions. Thank you.